Robert Henderson had everything money could buy. His mansion sat on 3 acres in the most expensive neighborhood in Beverly Hills, where the cheapest house cost more than most people would make in 10 lifetimes. The 60-year-old tech entrepreneur had built his fortune from nothing, creating software that every major company in the world now used. But success had a price, and somewhere along the way, Robert had forgotten how to see the people around him as anything more than functions. Every morning at exactly 7:30, Robert would walk down his marble staircase to find his breakfast, perfectly prepared and waiting on the dining room table. The newspaper would be pressed and folded just the way he liked it. His coffee would be the perfect temperature. His schedule for the day would be printed and placed next to his plate. This routine had happened without fail for 8 years. Yet, Robert had never once thought about who made it possible. Maria Santos moved through the Henderson mansion like a ghost. She had perfected the art of being invisible, cleaning around Robert while he worked, preparing his meals before he knew he was hungry, and maintaining his home so flawlessly that he never had to think about any of it. At 45, Maria had been working for wealthy families for over 20 years, but the Henderson house was different. It was the first place where she felt truly safe, even if her employer barely acknowledged her existence. Maria had arrived in Los Angeles when she was 19, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the phone number of a cousin who had promised to help her find work. She had left behind her family in a small town in Honduras, where opportunities were scarce and violence was becoming a daily reality. Like so many others, she had come to America chasing the dream of a better life, not just for herself, but for the family she had left behind. The work was hard, but Maria never complained. She sent most of her earnings back home, keeping just enough to live in a small apartment she shared with 2 other women. Her English had improved over the years, though she still spoke with a thick accent that made some people treat her as if she were invisible. This suited her fine. Being invisible meant job security in a world where many people like her lived in constant fear of being noticed by the wrong people. Robert's neighborhood was the kind of place where million-dollar cars sat in driveways, like everyday vehicles. Security cameras watched every corner, and private guards patrolled the streets. The residents were celebrities, politicians, and business moguls who valued their privacy above all else. Most had staff who lived off-site, but a few, like Robert, preferred to have someone available around the clock. Maria lived in a small apartment above the garage, an arrangement that worked perfectly for both of them. The first robbery happened on a Tuesday night in early October. The Williamson family had been attending a charity gala when thieves broke into their mansion just 4 houses down from Robert. The burglars had disabled the security system with professional precision and made off with over $2 million worth of jewelry, art, and electronics. What puzzled everyone was how they had known exactly where everything was located and how to avoid the most sophisticated security measures money could buy. By the end of the month, 3 more houses had been hit. Each robbery showed the same level of planning and inside knowledge. The thieves never seemed to waste time searching through rooms. They went straight to hidden safes, secret jewelry compartments, and valuable art pieces that most people would never know existed. The police were baffled, and the wealthy residents of the neighborhood were terrified. Robert installed additional security cameras and hired a private security firm to patrol his property. He moved his most valuable possessions to a bank vault and began varying his schedule to make it harder for anyone to predict his movements. Like everyone else in the neighborhood, he found himself looking over his shoulder and jumping at unexpected sounds. The sense of safety that his wealth had always provided was crumbling. But as Robert became increasingly paranoid, he noticed something strange about Maria. While everyone else in the neighborhood was on edge, she continued her daily routines, as if nothing had changed. She still arrived at work at the same time every morning, still went about her cleaning and cooking with the same calm efficiency, and showed no signs of concern about the string of break-ins that had everyone else terrified. At first, Robert assumed that Maria simply did not understand the gravity of the situation. Perhaps the language barrier prevented her from fully grasping what was happening, or maybe she was just too focused on her work to pay attention to neighborhood gossip. But as days turned into weeks, her composure began to seem almost supernatural. During the day, Robert would watch news reports about the robberies from his home office, constantly checking his security feeds and jumping every time the wind rattled a window. Meanwhile, Maria would move through the house with perfect calm, dusting furniture and arranging flowers as if she lived in the safest place on earth. When Robert mentioned the robberies to her, thinking she might not have heard about them, she would simply nod and say something like, "Very sad, Mr. Henderson, I pray for those families." The contrast became even more obvious during the neighborhood meetings that had started taking place every week. Residents would gather in each other's homes to share information and coordinate additional security measures. These meetings were filled with nervous energy, people speaking in hushed tones about alarm systems and escape plans. Robert would return home from these gatherings, feeling more anxious than ever, only to find Maria humming softly while she prepared his dinner, completely unaffected by the atmosphere of fear that had gripped everyone else. One evening, after a particularly tense neighborhood meeting where Mrs. Chen had broken down crying while describing how violated she felt after her home was burglarized, Robert came home to find Maria in the kitchen, calmly preparing his favorite meal. The contrast hit him like a slap in the face. Here was a woman who had far more to lose than any of his wealthy neighbors, living alone above his garage with no security guards or sophisticated alarm systems, yet she seemed completely at peace that night. Robert found himself really looking at Maria for the first time in years. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with graying hair that she always kept pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands were rough from years of hard work, but she moved with a grace and efficiency that spoke of someone who took pride in what she did. There was something in her eyes, a depth and intelligence that Robert realized he had never noticed before, that made him wonder what thoughts were going through her mind as she went about her work. As November arrived and the robberies continued, Robert's curiosity about Maria's unusual calm grew stronger. He began to pay closer attention to her behavior, not in a suspicious way, but with genuine puzzlement. How could someone who had so much less protection remain so unworried while people, with every possible security measure, were living in fear? What did Maria know that the rest of them did not? And why had it taken a crime wave for him to realize that he had been sharing his home with a person he knew almost nothing about? The questions troubled Robert more than he expected. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering about the life of someone who worked for him. Where did Maria go on her days off? Did she have family? What were her fears and hopes? How had he managed to live in the same house with someone for 8 years without ever really seeing her as a complete human being? These thoughts would prove to be just the beginning of a journey that would change both of their lives forever. The 5th robbery happened on a rainy Thursday night in early December. This time, the thieves hit the Morrison family's estate, just 2 houses away from Robert's mansion. The robbery followed the same pattern as all the others: professional, precise, and disturbingly well-informed. The burglars had somehow known that the family would be out of town for their daughter's college graduation, and they had managed to locate a hidden wall safe that even some of the family's closest friends didn't know existed. Robert woke up to the sound of police sirens and flashing lights. From his bedroom window, he could see officers swarming the Morrison property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like angry fireflies. His first instinct was to check his own security system, making sure every camera was working, and every door was locked. The thieves were getting closer to his house with each robbery, and the thought made his stomach twist with anxiety. When he went downstairs for breakfast that morning, Robert expected to find Maria as shaken as he was. Instead, she greeted him with her usual warm smile and placed his coffee cup in exactly the right spot, just as she had done every morning for 8 years. Her hands were steady as she served his eggs, and her voice was calm when she asked if He would like her to prepare lunch for later in the day. Robert studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of fear or concern. Nothing. Maria's expression was as peaceful as if she had just returned from a relaxing vacation instead of spending the night just yards away from a major crime scene. She went about her morning routine with the same quiet efficiency as always, humming softly under her breath while she wiped down the kitchen counters. This was when Robert first began to notice something that would puzzle him for weeks to come. Maria seemed to have an almost magical ability to anticipate problems before they happened. That very morning, she suggested that Robert might want to work from his upstairs office instead of the ground floor study where he usually spent his days. She mentioned something about the windows needing cleaning, but when Robert looked at them, they appeared spotless as always. Later that week, Maria made another unusual suggestion. She recommended that Robert move some of his most prized possessions, including a valuable painting and an antique clock, from the main living room to his bedroom upstairs. When Robert asked why, Maria simply said she thought they would look better in a different location. The suggestion seemed innocent enough, but it struck Robert as odd because Maria had never commented on his decorating choices before. These small incidents might have seemed meaningless to most people, but Robert's success in business had come from his ability to spot patterns that others missed. His mind was trained to notice when things were out of the ordinary, and Maria's behavior was definitely becoming unusual, not suspicious exactly, but different in ways that he couldn't quite put his finger on. As December progressed, the robberies continued at a terrifying pace. The thieves struck again just before Christmas, hitting 3 more houses in the span of 1 week. The entire neighborhood was in panic mode. Some families packed up and moved to hotels until the crime wave ended. Others hired armed security guards to patrol their properties around the clock. The local police increased their patrols, but the burglars seemed to stay one step ahead of every security measure. Robert found himself checking his locks multiple times each night and jumping at every small sound. He installed motion sensors in his garden and added extra cameras to monitor the perimeter of his property. Sleep became difficult, and he often found himself standing at his bedroom window at 3 in the morning, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But while Robert's anxiety reached new heights with each passing day, Maria continued to move through the house like nothing had changed. She still took her evening walks around the garden without any apparent concern for her safety. She still left the garage apartment at the same time each night, never varying her routine despite the obvious danger. When Robert suggested that she might want to stay inside after dark, Maria simply thanked him for his concern and assured him that she would be careful. The contrast between Maria's behavior and everyone else's became even more apparent during Robert's daily conversations with his neighbors. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had installed so many security lights that her house looked like a small airport at night. Mr. Kim had hired 3 different security companies and was considering buying a guard dog. Everyone was on edge, sharing information about suspicious cars and unknown faces in the neighborhood. Yet whenever these conversations took place in Robert's presence, and Maria happened to be nearby, she would continue her work without showing any interest in the details being discussed. She never asked questions about the robberies or seemed curious about the police investigation. If anything, she appeared almost bored by the topic that had consumed everyone else's attention. This strange calm of Maria's began to fascinate Robert in a way that surprised him. He started paying closer attention to her daily routines. Not because he suspected her of anything wrong, but because her behavior was so different from what he expected. How could someone in her position, living alone with limited resources and no security team, remain so completely unaffected by the climate of fear that had gripped the entire neighborhood? One afternoon in late December, Robert decided to test his growing theory that Maria somehow knew more about the situation than she was letting on. He mentioned to her that he was thinking about going out to dinner that evening, something he rarely did during weekdays. Maria's response was immediate and unexpected. She suggested that he might want to stay home instead, mentioning that she had planned to make his favorite meal and that the weather forecast called for heavy rain later. Robert had not mentioned anything about rain, and when he checked the weather forecast, it called for clear skies. Yet something in Maria's tone made him decide to follow her suggestion. That night, the house 3 doors down was robbed while the owners were out at a restaurant. The thieves struck during a brief but intense rainstorm that had not been predicted by any weather service. The coincidence was too strange to ignore. Robert began to wonder if Maria had some kind of sixth sense about danger, or if there was something else going on that he didn't understand. He started making mental notes of her suggestions and recommendations, looking for patterns that might explain her unusual ability to anticipate problems. Over the next few days, Robert paid even closer attention to Maria's behavior. He noticed that she seemed to be more aware of her surroundings than most people realized. When she cleaned the windows, her eyes would linger on the street outside, watching cars and pedestrians with what looked like careful attention. When she worked in the garden, she would often pause in her tasks to observe the neighboring houses, as if she were keeping track of who was home and who was away. Most intriguing of all, Robert noticed that Maria had developed what appeared to be a mental map of the neighborhood's daily rhythms. She seemed to know which families traveled frequently, which houses had the most valuable possessions, and which properties had the weakest security measures. This knowledge could have seemed suspicious, but Maria's obvious concern for Robert's safety made it clear that she was not working with the criminals. Instead, Robert began to suspect that Maria was conducting her own private investigation into the robberies. The thought seemed almost ridiculous at first. What could a housekeeper possibly discover that trained police officers had missed? But the more he observed her behavior, the more convinced he became that Maria was actively trying to solve the mystery that had stumped everyone else. This realization led Robert to a disturbing question that he had never considered before. If Maria was indeed investigating the robberies on her own, what had motivated her to take such a risk? And more importantly, what did she know about the criminals that she hadn't shared with the police or with him? The answers to these questions would soon change everything Robert thought he knew about the woman who had been taking care of his home for 8 years. The night that changed everything started like any other evening in January. Robert had told Maria he would be attending a business dinner with potential investors downtown, something that usually kept him out until well past midnight. He had done this dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. The questions about Maria's strange behavior had been eating at him for weeks, and he had finally decided that he needed answers. Robert made a show of leaving the house at 7:30, just as he had told Maria he would. He drove his Mercedes out of the driveway and down the street, waving to the security guard at the neighborhood entrance just like always. But instead of heading toward downtown, he parked his car 3 blocks away in the lot of a small shopping center. Then he walked back through the shadows, using the same route he had taken as a teenager when he snuck out of his parents' house. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a multi-millionaire businessman, creeping through bushes like a common spy because he needed to understand what his own housekeeper was really doing. Part of him felt ridiculous, but a larger part knew that something important was happening in his house, and he had to find out what it was. Robert made his way to the back of his property, staying close to the hedge that separated his yard from the neighbors. The winter night was cold and clear, with enough moonlight to see without using a flashlight. He positioned himself behind the tool shed where he could see both the main house and Maria's apartment above the garage. From this spot, he had a clear view of most of the ground floor windows and the walkway that connected the garage to the main house. For the first hour, nothing happened. Maria moved around the house following her usual evening routine, turning on lights in different rooms as she cleaned up after dinner. Robert began to feel foolish for his dramatic spy mission. Maybe Maria really was just unusually calm by nature. Maybe he had been reading too much into perfectly innocent behavior. But then, at exactly 9:15, Maria did something that made Robert's blood run cold. She pulled out a small notebook and began walking through the house in a very systematic way, writing things down as she went. This wasn't her normal cleaning routine. She was documenting something, and she was being very careful about it. Robert watched in fascination as Maria moved from room to room with the notebook. She would stop at certain windows and write something down, then move to check door locks and security panels before making more notes. She spent extra time in Robert's study, carefully examining the locations of his computer, safe, and valuable art pieces. She even measured distances between furniture and windows, using her footsteps to count off the space. The most shocking moment came when Maria pulled out a small digital camera and began taking pictures. She photographed the security panel by the front door, the locations of motion sensors, and the blind spots where the exterior cameras couldn't see. She was creating a detailed record of every weakness in Robert's security system, and she was doing it with the skill of someone who had done this kind of work before. Robert's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The most obvious explanation was that Maria was working with the burglars, gathering information that would help them rob his house just like they had robbed all the others. The evidence was right there in front of him. The detailed notes, the photographs, the careful documentation of security weaknesses. Any reasonable person would call the police immediately. But something didn't feel right about that explanation. If Maria was working with criminals, why had she been trying to protect him? Why had she made all those suggestions that seemed designed to keep him safe? Why would she tell him to move valuable items to more secure locations if she was planning? To help someone steal them? Robert decided to keep watching, hoping to understand Maria's true intentions. What he discovered next completely changed his understanding of the situation. After finishing her documentation of the house, Maria sat down at the kitchen table and opened the notebook to a page that was already filled with writing. Robert couldn't read the details from his hiding spot, but he could see that the notebook contained much more than just information about his house. Maria pulled out a second notebook, this one even thicker than the first. She began comparing information between the two books, cross-referencing details, and making connections that seemed to excite her. Sometimes she would nod with satisfaction, as if she had confirmed something important. Other times she would frown and make additional notes, apparently finding gaps in her information that needed to be filled. The breakthrough moment came when Maria stood up and walked to the window that faced the street. She stood there for several minutes, not moving, just watching. Then she returned to her notebooks and wrote something with obvious urgency. Robert followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. A dark blue van was parked across the street, in a spot where no vehicle had been earlier in the evening. This was when Robert finally understood what Maria was really doing. She wasn't working with the burglars, she was tracking them. The notebooks weren't filled with information to help criminals rob houses. They were filled with observations about the criminals themselves. Maria had been conducting her own investigation into the robbery ring, and she had been doing it right under everyone's noses for months. The realization hit Robert like a physical blow. While he and his wealthy neighbors had been installing expensive security systems and hiring professional guards, his housekeeper had been quietly gathering the kind of intelligence that could actually solve the case. She had been watching, learning, and documenting everything with the patience and skill of a trained detective. Robert watched as Maria made more notes about the van, recording its license plate number and the exact time it had appeared. She seemed to be tracking patterns in the criminal's behavior, looking for clues that would help her predict their next move. The calm demeanor that had puzzled Robert for so long now made perfect sense. Maria wasn't unafraid because she was innocent or naive. She was unafraid because she knew exactly what was happening and was actively working to stop it. But why was she doing this alone? Why hadn't she gone to the police with her information? And why was she taking such enormous personal risks to protect a neighborhood full of people who barely acknowledged her existence? The answer to these questions came when Maria made a phone call. Robert couldn't hear the words, but he could see the distress on her face as she spoke. The conversation was brief, but it left Maria visibly shaken. She hung up the phone and sat down heavily at the kitchen table, holding her head in her hands like someone carrying an impossible burden. After a few minutes, Maria picked up her pen and began writing again, but this time her movements were different. She wasn't taking notes or recording observations. She was writing what looked like a letter, something long and emotional that required frequent pauses, as she searched for the right words. When she finished writing, she folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope, which she placed in a kitchen drawer. Robert realized that he had stumbled onto something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple burglary investigation. Maria wasn't just tracking criminals for the sake of justice or community safety. She was personally involved in this situation in a way that put her in serious danger, and she was handling it completely alone. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Maria made one more phone call, this one even more emotional than the first. Robert could see tears on her face as she spoke, and her free hand kept making gestures that suggested she was trying to convince someone of something important. When the call ended, Maria sat in silence for a long time, staring at her notebooks as if they contained the answers to problems much larger than a series of neighborhood robberies. Robert knew that he had seen enough. Whatever was happening, Maria needed help, and she needed it from someone who understood the full scope of what she was dealing with. Tomorrow, he would have to find a way to approach her about what he had discovered. But he would have to be very careful about how he did it. As he made his way back to his car, Robert's mind was spinning with questions and realizations. The woman he had barely noticed for 8 years was risking her life to protect him and his neighbors from criminals that the police couldn't catch. She had been carrying this burden alone, conducting a dangerous investigation while maintaining the perfect facade of a simple housekeeper. The next morning would bring a conversation that would change both of their lives forever. Robert barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images of Maria sitting at his kitchen table with those notebooks, documenting details that could get her killed if the wrong people found out. By 6 in the morning, he was already dressed and pacing around his bedroom, trying to figure out how to approach a conversation that could change everything. The morning routine felt different now that Robert knew what was really happening. When Maria brought his coffee at exactly 7:30, he studied her face carefully, looking for signs of the stress he knew she must be feeling. She looked tired, more tired than he had ever seen her before, but she still managed her usual warm smile and asked if he needed anything special for breakfast. Robert realized that he had been living with a person who was essentially leading a double life. During the day, she was the perfect housekeeper, invisible and efficient. But at night, she transformed into something else entirely. A detective, an investigator, someone willing to risk everything to solve a case that had stumped trained professionals. The courage that required was staggering. He waited until mid-morning when Maria was cleaning the living room to make his move. His heart was beating so fast he was sure she could hear it from across the room. 8 years of barely speaking to this woman beyond giving instructions, and now he was about to ask her to trust him with secrets that could put her life in danger. "Maria," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended, "could you sit down for a moment? I need to talk to you about something important." The change in her expression was immediate. The calm mask she always wore slipped just slightly, and Robert saw something that looked like fear flash across her face. She set down her cleaning supplies slowly, as if buying time to think, and took a seat on the edge of the couch. "Is everything okay, Mr. Henderson?" she asked, but her voice was different now, more careful, more guarded. Robert had practiced this conversation in his head dozens of times, but now that the moment was here, all his planned words disappeared. Instead, he found himself saying something he had never expected to say. "I know what you've been doing." he said quietly. "I know about the notebooks. I know you've been tracking the people who are robbing houses in our neighborhood." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Maria's face went completely white, and for a moment Robert thought she might faint. Her hands started shaking, and she gripped the edge of the couch cushion so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. She knew she had been caught. Robert moved slowly to the chair across from her, wanting to show that he wasn't angry or threatening. "Maria, I'm not going to call the police. I'm not going to fire you. I just need to understand what's happening, because I think you're in danger, and I want to help." Those words seemed to break something inside her. Maria put her face in her hands and started crying. Not the quiet, polite tears that people cry when they're embarrassed, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs that came from months of carrying an impossible burden alone. Robert had never been good with emotional situations, but something about seeing this strong, dignified woman fall apart in his living room made him forget his own discomfort. He got up and brought her a box of tissues, then sat back down and waited for her to be ready to talk. It took several minutes for Maria to compose herself enough to speak. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were red and swollen, but there was also something like relief in her expression. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about robberies. This is about my family. This is about my brother." And then the whole story came pouring out. Maria's younger brother Carlos was 23 years old and lived in Los Angeles. He had been working at a car repair shop trying to save money to bring more of their family to the United States. But 6 months ago, he had gotten involved with the wrong people. It started small, someone offering him extra money to provide, information about the expensive cars that came through the shop, information about where the owners lived, when they traveled, what kind of security systems they had. Carlos thought he was just passing along harmless details to people who were planning insurance scams or minor thefts. He had no idea that he was feeding information to a sophisticated burglary ring that was targeting the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. By the time he realized how serious the operation was, it was too late to get out. The criminals had threatened Carlos's life, but that wasn't the worst part. They had also threatened the family back in Honduras, Maria's elderly parents, her sister, and her sister's 2 young children. The message was clear. Carlos would continue to provide information, or people would start getting hurt. And to make sure he stayed in line, they wanted someone on the inside of the houses being targeted. That's when they had approached Maria. "They knew I worked for you," Maria said, her voice getting stronger as she told the story. "They knew I had access to your house and could see when you were home, when you traveled, where you kept valuable things. They wanted me to help them rob you and your neighbors." Robert felt sick as he listened. The idea that criminals had been targeting Maria, using her family as leverage to force her into betraying the people she worked for, was beyond anything he had imagined. "But you didn't help them," he said. "You've been trying to stop them." Maria nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't betray you, even though we barely talk. This house has been my safety for 8 years. You've never been mean to me, never made me feel small. I know you don't really see me, but you've given me a job and a place to live and a chance to help my family. I couldn't repay that by helping someone rob you." Instead of cooperating with the criminals, Maria had decided to try to stop them. She began documenting everything she could about their operation, the patterns in their robberies, the vehicles they used, the methods they employed to gather information. She had been building a case against them while pretending to go along with their demands, but it's getting harder, she continued. "They're getting suspicious because I haven't given them useful information about your house. And Carlos is scared. They've been pressuring him more, threatening to hurt our family if he doesn't produce better results. I think they're planning to do something soon, something big." Robert listened to all of this with growing amazement and horror. For months, while he had been worried about his own security, Maria had been fighting a battle to protect not just him, but the entire neighborhood. She had been doing it alone, with no training and no support, risking her own life and the lives of her family members. "Why didn't you go to the police?" he asked. Maria's laugh was bitter. "And tell them what? That my brother is involved with criminals? They would arrest him and deport me. Our family would still be in danger, but Carlos and I would be in jail or back in Honduras, where we can't help anyone. The police don't care about people like us, Mr. Henderson. We're disposable." Robert realized that Maria was probably right. The police would have treated Carlos as a criminal rather than a victim, and Maria as an accomplice rather than someone trying to help. The system wasn't designed to protect people in her situation. "So, what's your plan?" he asked. Maria was quiet for a long moment. "I've been trying to gather enough evidence to prove that Carlos was forced into this, that he's a victim too. I thought maybe if I could show the police everything I've learned about how the operation works, they might be willing to help us instead of just arresting us. But I'm running out of time." She pulled out her phone and showed Robert a text message that had arrived that morning. It was short and threatening. "No more delays. We need the Henderson house information by tomorrow night, or your family pays the price." Robert stared at the message, feeling a cold anger building in his chest. These people had been terrorizing a woman who had spent 8 years quietly taking care of his home. They had been using her family as hostages to force her into a situation that went against everything she believed in. And they thought they could threaten her in his house, under his roof. "Maria," he said, his voice steady and determined, "you're not going to face this alone anymore. We're going to stop these people. And we're going to do it in a way that keeps you and your family safe." For the first time since the conversation began, Maria looked hopeful. "How?" Robert smiled, and for the first time in months it was a real smile. "I didn't become successful by backing down from bullies, and I think it's time these criminals learned what happens when they mess with my family." The word surprised him as soon as he said it. Family. When had he started thinking of Maria that way? But as he looked at her sitting in his living room, trusting him with secrets that could get her killed, he realized that's exactly what she had become. The next 24 hours would prove to be the most intense of both their lives. Robert had built his fortune by thinking several steps ahead of his competitors, and now he applied that same strategic mind to protecting Maria and stopping the criminals who had been terrorizing his neighborhood for months. First, they needed to ensure Carlos's safety. Robert used his business connections to hire a private security firm that specialized in witness protection. Within hours, Carlos was moved to a safe house where the criminals couldn't reach him. But this was just the beginning of Robert's plan. "We're not just going to hide from these people," Robert told Maria as they sat in his study, surrounded by her notebooks and the evidence she had gathered. "We're going to give them exactly what they want, but on our terms." Maria looked confused. "I don't understand. You want me to help them rob your house?" Robert smiled. "Not exactly. We're going to let them think you're helping them, but we're going to control every aspect of what happens. Think about it. You've been studying these criminals for months. You know how they operate better than anyone, including the police. We're going to use that knowledge against them. The plan they developed was both simple and brilliant. Maria would provide the criminals with detailed information about Robert's house, just as they had demanded. But the information would be carefully crafted to lead them into a trap. Robert would appear to leave for a business trip, giving the criminals what seemed like the perfect opportunity to strike. In reality, he would be hidden in the house with a team of private security experts and enough recording equipment to document everything. But Robert's plan went far beyond just catching a few burglars. He had been doing research of his own, using his business resources to investigate the criminal organization that had been threatening Maria's family. What he discovered shocked even him. The burglary ring was much larger and more sophisticated than anyone had realized. It wasn't just a local operation. It was part of a network that stretched across multiple states, targeting wealthy communities and using vulnerable immigrants as unwilling accomplices. The people threatening Maria's family were responsible for dozens of robberies and had ruined countless lives by forcing innocent people into criminal activity. "This is bigger than just protecting our neighborhood," Robert told Maria. "If we do this right, we can take down the entire operation and help all the families they've been terrorizing." Robert reached out to a contact he had in the FBI, someone he had met through his business dealings who specialized in organized crime. Agent Thompson was initially skeptical about getting involved in what seemed like a local burglary case, but when Robert showed him Maria's evidence and explained the scope of the operation, everything changed. "This woman has done better detective work than most trained investigators," Agent Thompson said after reviewing Maria's notebooks. "She's documented patterns and connections that we never would have found on our own. If we can pull this off, we could shut down one of the most sophisticated burglary rings we've ever encountered." The sting operation they planned was like something out of a movie. Maria would send the criminals a detailed floor plan of Robert's house, along with information about his travel schedule and the locations of his most valuable possessions. The plan would be accurate enough to convince the criminals it was genuine, but it would also guide them directly into the trap that was being prepared. Robert moved his real valuables to a bank vault and replaced them with carefully prepared fakes that were equipped with tracking devices. Every room in the house was fitted with hidden cameras and microphones. A team of FBI agents would be positioned around the property, ready to move in once the criminals revealed enough about their operation to justify arrests. The most dangerous part of the plan was Maria's role. She would have to continue pretending to cooperate with the criminals right up until the moment of the robbery. If they suspected that she was working against them, they could still hurt her family or disappear before the authorities could catch them. On the night of the operation, Robert hid in a specially constructed safe room in his basement while Maria went through the motions of her normal evening routine. She had to act exactly as she would if she were really betraying her employer, showing no signs of the nervousness that was eating her alive inside. The criminals arrived at exactly 2:30 in the morning, just as Maria's intelligence had predicted they would. There were 4 of them, all professionals who moved with the confidence of people who had done this many times before. They disabled Robert's security system using information that Maria had provided, not knowing that a completely separate system was recording their every move. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. The burglars didn't just steal items and leave. They began making phone calls to other members of their organization, coordinating additional robberies and discussing their plans for expanding into new territories. They talked about other people they were threatening, other families they were using as leverage to force cooperation. For over an hour, the FBI recorded detailed conversations about criminal activities spanning 3 states. The evidence they gathered that night would eventually lead to the arrest of more than 30 people and the dismantling of an organization that had been operating for over 5 years. But the most shocking moment came when the leader of the group made a phone call to someone he called the boss. Robert and the FBI agents listened in amazement as the conversation revealed connections to legitimate businesses and even some government officials who had been providing information and protection to the criminal network. When the FBI finally moved in to make the arrests, they had enough evidence to prosecute not just the burglars, but an entire corruption network that had been enabling their crimes for years. The story broke in the national news 3 days later. The headlines were incredible. Housekeeper's investigation brings down multi-state crime ring, and domestic worker becomes hero in major FBI operation. But what really shocked the world wasn't just the successful takedown of the criminals, it was what Robert Henderson did next. Robert could have been satisfied with helping to solve the case and protecting Maria's family. Instead, he decided to use his experience to address a problem that most wealthy people never even thought about. He had learned that domestic workers all over the country were being targeted by criminals who saw them as easy entry points into wealthy homes and communities. At a press conference that was broadcast around the world, Robert announced the creation of the Domestic Worker Protection Foundation, funded with $50 million of his own money. The foundation would provide legal protection, security services, and emergency relocation for domestic workers who found themselves threatened by criminals. For 8 years, Maria Santos worked in my home, and I barely saw her as a person, Robert said to the gathered reporters. When she was facing the most dangerous situation of her life, she was completely alone because people like me had failed to create systems that would protect people like her. That changes now. But Robert didn't stop there. He hired Maria as the foundation's co-director, giving her a salary that was 10 times what she had been earning as a housekeeper. He helped her bring her entire family to the United States legally and safely. He used his business connections to create job training programs that would help domestic workers develop new skills and advance their careers. The foundation grew rapidly, attracting support from other wealthy individuals who had been inspired by Robert and Maria's story. Within a year, it had helped over 1,000 domestic workers facing various forms of exploitation and threats. Maria became a prominent advocate for worker rights, speaking at conferences around the world about the vulnerabilities faced by people in domestic work. Her courage in standing up to the criminals who had threatened her family inspired other workers to report exploitation and abuse they had been suffering in silence. The criminals who had terrorized Maria's family were sentenced to long prison terms. Carlos testified against the organization that had forced him to participate in their crimes, and his cooperation helped convict several additional members of the network. But perhaps the most important change was in Robert himself. The man who had spent 8 years barely acknowledging the person who took care of his home became one of the country's most vocal advocates for treating domestic workers with dignity and respect. Maria taught me that heroes don't always look like what we expect, Robert said in an interview 6 months after the arrests. Sometimes they're the quiet people who serve us every day, and we're too blind to see their strength until a crisis forces us to really look. The story of Robert and Maria became a symbol of how people from completely different backgrounds could come together to fight injustice. It showed that real change was possible when those with power chose to use it to protect those without it. Years later, when people asked Robert about the night that changed his life, he would always say the same thing. I thought I was protecting my home from burglars. What I really learned was how to see the person who had been protecting me all along.